This is a croissant from a bakery here in Paris. Today, I'm gonna try and make one in my home kitchen. I love croissants. I think they're just fantastic. One of my absolute favorite pastries.
Hey, who wants to share a croissant with this guy? Croissants, I love croissants.
Oh yeah.
But they're notoriously hard to make. You have to make the dough, you have to use a butter block, you have to fold it, you have to make sure it doesn't get too hot. It take anywhere from up to a day, probably at minimum, and I've seen up to 3 days on some recipes. I'm gonna try and make this in just 30 minutes. I'm gonna cut this down so that we can have some way of gauging if our final product is as good as this at the end. So you can see all of these layers here.
Layers! Ogres have layers.
This is a key characteristic of a croissant. You get this by laminating the dough. Don't worry, we're gonna talk about that a little bit later, but our end product is gonna need to have something that's light and something that's layered like this. I can guarantee there is a ton of butter in here.
Butter is nutritious and it tastes great.
It's French food, they always have lots of butter. It's outrageously good. Light, flaky, in my view, a perfect pastry. So in this recipe, what I'm gonna try and do is cut a few of the traditional things that croissant makers, pastry chefs, and those types of people do to try and make croissants in, well, really just 30 minutes of work, couple hours in total. And any recipe for croissant is going to start with flour. In this case, bread flour. The bread flour has more protein. What that's gonna do is it's gonna help with gluten development. It's gonna create a more stable dough. It's gonna rise a bit more. And when it rises, it's gonna allow it to hold its shape. There's a few little tips to look out for. So there's this number here. W is greater than 300. This number basically tells you how much protein is in the flour. Weaker flours that you would use for cake would typically have a W number that's between 90 and 160. All-purpose flours, somewhere in between there. The second number that you might see here, the T number is a French system. Basically, it's a complicated system that where they burn off flour and it's how much ash is left. T45 is cake flour. T65 is that high protein bread flour that's gonna make a really good bread, or in this case, a really good croissant. Enough talking about flour, let's jump in the kitchen and start making this thing. So we're gonna start off with some water in here. I want warm water, about 32 degrees Celsius. Close enough, hopefully, 31. I'm gonna add a little bit of instant yeast or bread making yeast into here as well. All right, it's smooth. I'm gonna set this aside for 10 minutes. Now in another bowl, I'm gonna add my flour, my salt, and my sugar. And then just whisk everything until it's incorporated. So I've got my butter. It's essential that this is very, very cold. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna slice this way into very, very thin strips. Coat these in the dry mixture. This will help them from sticking together in the next cutting step. Okay, once every piece is coated, we'll go back onto the cutting board, and then in little stacks, we'll cut them down. Once they're sort of in these little noodle shapes, sprinkle with a bit more flour, and cut down the last way. So now, as opposed to a butter block, we have these little butter cubes. So these cubes, these butter cubes, are the first thing that we've done differently, and really the main thing that we're gonna do differently when making these croissants. Usually what you would do is make a butter block. So you have to form butter, basically this block, and you have to generally work pretty quickly. Now what we have to do is basically the same process that you would use on a traditional croissant, laminate the dough, folding the dough over top of the fat. What that does is create the layers that we saw at the beginning of this video. And in fact, I'm a little bit concerned in this recipe because we made this more like a pie dough as opposed to a croissant. We didn't follow the traditional steps. I'm a little concerned we're not gonna get all the layers that we want. But, you know, we've come this far, so let's see how this recipe works out. And I'm gonna massage the butter just with my fingers, basically pressing the flour into the butter, moving it all around to make a well in the center. And I've got some cold water here from my tap, but we want this ice cold, so I'm gonna add a few ice cubes into it and measure out 113 grams. Into the well goes my yeast mixture and that ice water that I just made. And with a spoon, I'm gonna distribute all the moisture into the flour. I also wanna try and cut and fold the dough. So it's just starting to come together. There are still some dry bits and some pieces that haven't completely come together. That's perfectly fine. I want to turn this out onto my counter, form this into a rectangle. And so now using a bench scraper, I'm going to fold it over into thirds, sort of like you would fold a letter. So I rotated this 90 degrees. It was this way before, now it's sort of this way. I'm going to use a rolling pin and we're going to do that 2 more times, 3 in total. That's my dough. It does need to chill out in the fridge for at least 30 minutes. Now, you could leave this overnight. The longer you leave it, the more complex, I guess, of a flavor you're gonna get, but at least 30 minutes to let this firm up. So, into the fridge. So now I need to roll this out one more time. I want sort of this direction to be about 12 inches. It's gonna go about 12 inches this way as well. All right, that's pretty close. I'm just gonna trim off the edges so that it's exactly a square. So I'm gonna do about every 4 inches, 10 centimeters or so this way. And then last but not least, I'm gonna go on a diagonal to get triangles. Now to roll these into the croissant shape, base of the triangle goes towards me, spritz with a bit of water. With the heel of your hand, basically roll this way. Now I need to egg wash these, and we're gonna let them proof for about 90 minutes. They're gonna get a lot puffier, the yeast is gonna start doing its work, and it's hopefully gonna give us those layers that we really wanted at the beginning. So I realized about halfway into proofing these, after about 45 minutes or so, that the recipe wanted them to proof at 30 or 32 degrees Celsius. Certainly not 32 degrees inside my house. So what I did is I put these in my oven at the absolute lowest temperature that it would go. Now, these have started to puff up a little, so I think they're good. I think this is gonna still work. Last thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna egg wash these, and then these are going into a 400 Fahrenheit, 200 Celsius oven for about 18 minutes or so, maybe 20. We'll see how they look. We've got a homemade croissant. I mean, it looks pretty good. It smells crazy like butter. Let's cut this one in half and see how the layers look. So, I mean, not quite as good as the one that we had in Paris. We are still getting some nice layers, and let's give it a try. Super good, super buttery. It's really light, really, flaky. I would say it's probably not as airy as that croissant that we had in Paris. This is about 20% of the effort, and, the recipe says it's 80% is good. I think it's even better than that. It was about 30 minutes worth of work. Probably took about 2.5 hours in total. Leave a comment if you ever made croissants before, or if you've seen this method. If you enjoyed this recipe, smash the like button below. Really helps out the channel. Subscribe if you want to see more videos. That's it for today. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time. Pretty decent croissant recipe.